Okay, so just a quick intro to what's called box modeling. What we're going to be doing with Cinema 4D is we're going to be using a modeling technique called box modeling. So in the old days, in the oldest days of 3D animation, everything was made from polygons, and so the easiest and quickest, most efficient way to create a character was by literally making a box and then adding more geometry to that box and pushing and pulling. And that's why it's called box modeling, is because you would start with a very basic cube and just add to it as you needed. So it starts with a very simple shape, and then you create more complex shapes from that. So that's why when you open up old games like Final Fantasy or Mario 64, things are very much looking kind of blocky and boxy because they're trying to use as few polygons as possible to create those characters. So nowadays we have things like ZBrush, where you can literally sculpt as if you are in a clay environment, and then go back into a 3D program and re-topologize, like add those quadrilateral polygons to it to make it editable, or to make it deformable or animatable later. But in our case, even though that software exists and you have the ability to do much more detailed sculptures and things like that, knowing this approach is actually really great to know, because knowing this approach is really good in your workflow, because you're going to know how to solve problems with geometry, how to create new geometry from existing geometry. This is just a very it's kind of a fundamental skill. So when you're a modeler and you want to get into modeling, knowing this approach is really good, because it takes you from the very, very basic level to a very advanced modeling technique very, very quickly. So that's why we're going to be using box modeling, is because it works across all software, no matter whether you're in Cinema 4D or if you're in Maya. This is a very good this is just a really good approach to know. So let's go back to our model here. And I'm going to start with a cube, just like I said. So where did it show up? It showed up right at the 0 point in the world. So what we can do is bring it up to actually center it up with our torso. And I'm going to start to model this out a little bit. So this is our first little bit of modeling. We start to just kind of push and pull the primitives around until we got something that sort of matches what her torso is going to look like here. And actually, you know what? I'll make it the full length of her torso. Okay. Now it's like, yeah, so now we've got a corner here, a corner here, a corner here, and a corner here. You can already tell that, like, I want to start to squeeze and pull and do more to this. And that's why it's helpful to know how to add geometry to this. But let's just make sure from the side it's also lined up nicely before we start adding edge loops and topology to this. And right here, you can't really, tell what's going on, so that's okay. I just want to start to model from this front and side view for now to get things moving. So let's go ahead and we'll add a segment in our Y. So when I start to add lines to this, over here I can still add lines just using the parametric properties. But right now I just want to have that one line across the middle on her waist. And it'll be just by adding a Y segment right here. Now let's go ahead and hit C to make it editable. Okay, so now what you can do is you can start to push and pull points or edges. What I want to do first is grab these edges here. Sorry, grab these vertices here, go to your scale tool and just scale them in, just like that. I'm actually going to move these back a little bit to line up with her waist, right there. And boom, you're starting to do character modeling at this point. So the more lines you start adding, the more you want to pull them and just push them to actually line up with your reference. So let's just, I'm going to show you how to do what's called a loop selection. If you do a U and then L, you can grab the very edge loop, but I think you have to have it, there we go, on the very bottom. I've got them selected now, and I can just scale them out again. And now let's do that loop cut tool once more. I'm going to do an M and an L for loop cut. I'm going to make sure we're on edges though. And right about here, you can actually hold Shift and it will give you perfect segments. So right here, this is exactly 50% of the way. I'm going to go ahead and just hit Shift and click that. We're going to do the same right up here. I'm going to do a loop selection on this edge and do another scale. Loop selection on this edge, we'll do another scale. And just like that, we've already got ourselves kind of a decent body shape that we're going to work with. But let's do it once more right here at the top. I'm just going to eyeball this one. I'm going to loop select the top, and I'm just going to bring it in a little bit. Okay. So at this point, it's probably good to start talking about what's called the symmetry tool, where we have ourselves a basic torso shape, but she's going to be the same on the left and the right, both with her legs and her arms. So when we start modeling this stuff, it's just going to be really helpful to only have to model one side. So what I want to do first is I want to make another loop selection or loop cut right in the center, down the middle by holding Shift. And I'm going to delete the entire side of vertices by grabbing just like the rectangle select, making sure that it's only select visible elements is off and tolerant selection is off too. You can just grab the whole left side and turn it off or delete them. And under this cube, let's just go ahead and call this woman body. Under this menu here, you've got a whole lot of options, but we're just going to use the symmetry tool. If you hold Option while you have your mesh selected, you can just copy over the entire side. So now every modeling bit that I do on the right will get mirrored over to the left. It's just really helpful to be able to do that. It just makes everything a lot easier. So one thing to note, though, is that when you start to do things like sculpting, and I'm just going to show this to you. We'll talk about sculpting in a little bit, but sometimes you'll move things around and somehow the middle gets really, really off and you're like, oh no, like these all need to be right in the center. How am I going to do that? Do I need to grab each point and just move it over like this? Like, how am I going to do that? So I'm just going to show you a quick tip on how to make sure these are all lined up and right in the center. If you grab a loop selection, or once we get a more complicated character going, it's going to be harder to just grab this whole center line, so we may have to do a path selection, which we'll talk about. But when you have all of these vertices selected and you know that they're all the ones that need to be in the center, get your scale tool out. This is a really fun tip that somebody showed me once. And on this X scale key, just hold Shift while you're doing it. Oops. What you can do is as you're holding Shift and you're dragging down your X scale, you'll see that it's going in increments of 10. Just get it all the way down to 0. What that's doing is it's lining them up. It's zeroing out the X coordinates of all of these so that they're all lined up. Now that they're all lined up, it's really helpful to know how to do that. You can just go down to this position, and where it says 6 or whatever it is, you can hit Apply, and it will bring it back to the 0 position of the actual world. And that's where you want it to be able to do this symmetry. You can turn on and off a symmetry object just by clicking that check mark. But for now, we'll leave it on. And let's start to add even more detail. This is starting to get really fun. So at the top here, I want to do what's called an extrude to bring up some of this detail in the neck. This is a new modeling tool that we're going to learn. It's called the extrude tool. So when we're on our body geometry here, I think what I want to do is delete the face, because I just want to work with these edges here. And I'm going to do a loop select to grab the top edge and just stop at the boundary loop. I guess it doesn't recognize that this is a boundary loop. So what I need to do instead is called a path selection. So a U and an M is going to bring up your path selection. It's under also, I believe, select, path selection. What that lets you do is it lets you drag where you want your selection to go. So that's a really helpful thing to know when you just need to grab a few lines that you want to move around. So right now I can just do this. Or what we're going to do now is called extrude. And first let me do what I did with those vertices and just line them up in the Y by holding Shift and dragging down to 0. So now they're perfectly aligned. So now let's extrude this upward, and I'm going to make sure that it kind of shrinks in as it gets to this neck point, and it becomes much thinner as it goes up towards her head. So if we hit M and then T for extrude, just click anywhere on your viewport and it'll bring out some more edges. And it's already kind of going towards the center, which is fine, but I actually want to bring it in even more. So while you're extruding, you can let go and you can click your scale key. And see how it's trying to mirror everything over. And that's where these vertices can just get off center. That's okay. Well, this is modeling. You know, this is just part of the process. We just have to sort of deal with a little bit of pushing and pulling as we create new geometry wherever we're going. So let's do a few more extrusions. And see how it's trying to continue in the direction of wherever that edge loop is going. So what I want to do now is just get these nice and straight. I'm going to grab these vertices again. I'll do a quick path selection to get these. Just going to grab the ones that need to be right in the center, right here, here, and here. Make sure they're on the 0 on the x-axis. There we go. So now we've got this indication of where her neck's going to start. Let's go back to our lines and let's start to move these upward. And what I want to do now is just start to shape this a little bit more so that it's actually the shape of where her neck is. So you can see over here the head goes up a lot further than the one on the left. Is that true? Yeah, if I bring this all the way up like this, it looks like this one doesn't quite reach and this one is a lot shorter. So I might have made her neck a little too long on this other one. I kind of like the length of the one on the right, so I'm just going to kind of put it around here. Interesting. Okay, so now we can do some pushing and pulling. And what I think I'm going to do is turn off our display of all the texturing. I just want to be able to see the lines. Just like this one. Right over here we have just the lines. That's kind of what I want. And you can already see this edge over here is a lot further out than it needs to be, so let's bring it in. And this edge, the same thing. So right there, what's happening here is this axis is on what's called the object axis. The coordinate system is this. It thinks that this is the z, this is the y, and this is the x going backward. And that's not really what I want in the case of this particular model. So what I want to do is change it to world while I'm just moving this edge around, just to give me a better idea of where it actually is. And what I want to do is go back to vertex mode, bring this one up a little bit, and start to move these in a little bit. So let's actually grab the edge. Do the same for the top. And also this vertex here. This is the front of her neck where it meets the chest. So that needs to be about right here. Yeah, it's really interesting how this one is way off from the side one. This neck will have some rounding to it. You know, when we actually go in and start cutting more loops here, we can start to round this out and make it really appealing. But for now, we always want to start, this is something I like to talk about with modeling, is making sure you start with very large shapes so that you can then add detail later. So start big, end small. Be as simple as you can with these early shapes so that you can just get an indication of where the model is and where the volumes are. See if I'm forgetting anything. Okay. So we're almost done with this neck area just for now, just to get it blocked in. I think I'm going to turn off snapping as well. Okay. So yeah, this is where just, you know, this is modeling, you know, that like what I'm doing here, and I'm just grabbing vertices and I'm starting to push and pull them. I'm getting a feel for where I actually want this body to be. You know, right here, this back is not quite lined up the way I want it. So what I might do is actually adjust this one. Yeah, I think I'm going to adjust this side view down a little bit by hitting that Shift V, going to the back, and dropping it down a little bit so that it lines up a little bit better. Okay, so now they're a little bit more the same. They're a little bit more lined up. Okay. So at this point, I want to talk about what's called the brush tool. If you hit M and then B, I'm sorry, that's bridge. If you hit M and then C, it brings up your brush tool. Why do these hotkeys have completely different letters than they actually are? I don't know. It's probably because there are so many modeling tools that if you just try to do a B for all of them, you know, there's bevel, there's bridge, there's brush. There's just too many, so it's just what it is, and you start to learn them as you do it. But if you just bring up your M key, you can just see what the hotkey is for what you want to use. But the brush tool, this is actually Cinema 4D's sort of sculpture tool, and you see that there's this this cursor that becomes this sort of wide circle. If you hit your middle mouse button and drag left and right, you'll see that there's actually a, you know, there's that gradient, familiar gradient for like a brush, and you're changing the size of it. If you hold middle mouse button and drag up and down, that gradient gets lighter or darker depending on which direction you're going. That's the strength of the brush. But what is the brush? Let's go take a look at what it does. So if I hit M and then C again, you can bring up your brush tool over here in your attributes menu. There's a fall off. It asks if you just want to be along the surface while you're working. There's this mode right here, and this is what we really want to pay attention to. The smear mode is what I'm going to be using to just kind of like pull some of these points around and do some quick sculpting based on what I'm looking at over here. And there's also something called the smooth mode, which was another fun one that I like to work with. But we'll keep the strength kind of low, you know, around 18–20%, and the radius kind of high. And if you start pulling these points, that's maybe a little bit too high, too wide, I mean. Let's get closer, and then we'll start to pull these points a little bit. You can see it's actually just grabbing the entire, grabbing those points and moving them where I'm pushing and pulling them. So this is a nice way to work very quickly if you are trying to model something. So I can definitely see that we are going to need a lot more geometry in order to get this in a place that we are ready to move on. So let's do that now. First, let me just make sure these are all lined up in the center. And this is what I mean when I did this loop selection, it actually grabbed a few extra. I don't want that. I want to make sure it only grabs this center loop, and I'm going to scale it down. That was the snapping tool, Michael, that was making that jump all the way out.
Yeah, that was gonna be my guess.
Okay. All right, so now that those are right in the center, let's go ahead and add a little bit more geometry. So right here, I want to loop right here. I'm going to start to add more detail to this torso and round it out here. You know, at the corners, we don't want it to have a really square looking body. So we're going to round it out by adding a little bit more geometry around here. And I'm going to go back to that brush tool, make sure that select all, you have to deselect all to make sure that you don't just grab those points. But if you do just want to focus on just a few points, you could just select what you want to use the brush tool on and start to sculpt it that way. But let's just do a deselect all by hitting Command-Shift-A. I'm just pulling these points around to round it out some. I actually kind of want this shoulder to go all the way out, right around here. Let's add a few more loops. We're going to do it from the side view. Just do it half and half, right there. So we can do a little bit more of a taper into the top of her neck. Okay. Right here, we're going to need a little bit more detail. Okay. And now I want to show you how to round out some of this stuff the easy way. Because, you know, one thing I've just learned how to do over time is just by grabbing each of these points and pulling it towards the center so that it actually starts to round out like this. I just grab this little, you know, if you go over your axes, there's an x-axis, which is red, and then there's the blue axis, which is Z, and then you've got this y-axis. But if you just grab these little corners here, you can just move both those axes at the same time. So I know I'm kind of going in the direction of that, the normal, you know, which is back towards the body. But the easiest way to round these out is to go back to that brush, go to your smooth. I'm going to make sure this is nice and low. Let's make it a 5%, because if you start to go across geometry, Cinema 4D is going to try to smooth it out to almost like a ball. But this is a really easy way to start to just round out some of these corners, because it's looking at this and thinking, okay, well, what's the best way to smooth this? Well, the easiest thing to do is just kind of like make it a little bit rounder right through here. So I'm just using a very low strength brush in the brush tool to round out some of this stuff. You can see it's doing its job. Right here, it's still pretty cornery, so let's just go across this a little bit. And once it's rounder, I can do a little bit more sculpting with it. So yeah, there's a hard way and there's an easy way. The hard way is to go through and actually grab each of these points individually and move them towards the center of this model. What I'm doing is much more efficient, and it gets us the results that we want faster. And so we can see it's starting to pull in where I don't want it to. That's where it's nice to just be able to pull things out again. And again, you know, I just every now and then I realize that it's grabbing these points and moving them off the center so our symmetry isn't working anymore. I've got to do that loop select once more and make sure I don't select any of these. Somebody might have a better method on how to keep this from happening, but this has worked for me so far, and it doesn't take that long to recenter those points. So there we have a much more detailed torso. Let's see how it compares to our model. It's really not bad. It's actually not too far off from what we want. If we look at towards the back, her neck looks like it's leaning a little bit too far forward. So let's deselect some of this stuff, and I'm going to, from this side view, turn off smooth and go back to smear. I'm going to start to move these points back some. Because I want this to be like kind of straight up and down. Okay, so these are all a little bit wonky now, but there's a good, you know, we just go back to our loop selection. Okay, so to grab these without going over the boundary edge to like loop back around, just make sure the stop at boundary edges is checked. But I'm just going to grab each of these loops, go back to my scale tool, and scale them down into Y so that they're perfectly aligned. Straight up and down. It's going to really be noticeable right here. I didn't grab them all, so I'm just going to do a path selection for this one. Okay, so it could be smart for me to do that all the way down, just to make sure all of these loops are pretty aligned with each other, and it makes the topology a lot easier to read. So maybe I'll do that and we'll just fast forward through it. I'm pressing UL and I'm grabbing my T key. Shift and dragging that down so that it's perfectly aligned. So the brush tool is really important in this process because it gets you the shapes that you need a lot quicker than if you were to try to model everything by hand. It is good to know how to move these points around, but in a lot of cases, you can just get there with a brush tool and then just start to do something like this to align everything. We'll do a path selection. And down here, I think I'm going to go ahead and delete these faces. Or quickest way to delete these faces is just delete this vertex, because then it's not going to try to add an edge from all of these vertices to the center one. It just automatically deletes it, and there's an extra one. Okay, and then I'll do my path selection UM, making sure that it's just that bottom loop. Scale those down as well. Let's compare that to our model. Okay. So this line that I'm indicating with that I've made with the shirt, I may want to model in rather than use a texture for. So we'll get to that. At this point, what I want to do though is I want to continue on with the arms and the hands. Just taking a look at how this stuff is lining up. I don't think I grabbed this loop up here, so let me do that. Okay. So now we have a nice torso to work with, and we can start to add these arms. And the good thing is we're only going to have to do this once because the other side is going to copy as we do it.